Of this panel, and I'll make an introduction of the panelists. And at the end, we're going to have time for questions and answers. So if you don't mind, I will ask for 5 persons to make questions, and then maybe the panelists can answer. Or if you don't agree with that, we can do it in 3 times. Give about a second. So I'm going to introduce Roxanna Altholtz. She's Assistant Clinical Professor of Law, Associate Director for the International Human Rights Law Team at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. Roxanna has a distinguished record as a human rights attorney that encompasses a wealth of experience in the Americas and years. She served as legal advisor for the United Nations missions in Kosovo, in 1999 to 2000, and as staff attorney at the Center for Justice and International Law in Washington, D.C. from 2000 to 2005. As a leading author, she presented other opinions in human rights litigation before the American system. As legal counsel, she obtained several groundbreaking judgments from the International Court of Human Rights holding governments accountable for paramilitary activity in Colombia, state-sanctioned murder in Guatemala, torture and arbitrary detention in Ecuador, and discriminatory policies and practices in the Dominican Republic. As the clinic associate director, she has developed and directed advocacy initiatives to draft a code of conduct for companies in the information and communication sector to address the impact of Hurricane Katrina on immigrant communities and to expose human rights violations suffered by immigrant communities in California's Central Valley, and to ensure government compliance with the International Court ruling on behalf of Dominican born supremacy. And also, as of from the 1st of May, she was an award that also was young academic. And the award name is, ¿cómo se llama? Yamamita. Yamashita. So I think it's, I thought it was good to everybody knows that students are and then I presented you before and after. Yeah.
Then I'm going to have to ask, will you guys help? Can we switch to the other PowerPoint? Is that okay? Keyboard? I do have the keyboard. I don't know what's Can you help me? Sorry. So while we do that, let me tell you about what I'm going to present today about. So I want to talk about international accountability efforts by describing the anatomy of the case before the American system. In 2005, the Helen Mack Foundation, of which Helen is the president, and dozens of family members of individuals who were disappeared by Guatemalan security forces during the conflict submitted a petition against the state of Guatemala before the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. I'm going to provide this analogy by describing the context that surrounded the case, which is commonly referred to as the Despot-Dossier case, and highlight some of the key moments of the litigation, and then offering some details about how the state of Guatemala defended itself in this litigation for state accountability. And what we see is, in the state's defense strategy, certain parallels between what the state did before an international court and how they defend themselves domestically, how the U.S. defense team defended the U.S. domestically in criminal proceedings. Now we have to switch PowerPoints. So there's another PowerPoint. So DM presentation. Great. So I think it's important to begin by describing what we're trying to hold Guatemala accountable for. In this case, the core issue is forced disappearance. So let me begin by defining what a forced disappearance is. In international law, forced disappearance is defined as an ongoing crime. It is the act of depriving a person of freedom which is perpetrated by agents of the state or persons acting with the state, and followed by an absence of information or refusal to acknowledge or give information about the victim's whereabouts, thereby impeding access to legal remedies and procedural guarantees. The crime of forced disappearance is masterful in its ability to terrorize the victim, their family, and their community. There is no body in a forced disappearance. Evidence is concealed or destroyed to ensure impunity for the crime and to facilitate stigmatization of victims as terrorists and delinquents. The proof of their guilt is the fact that they were disappeared. Under the reign of impunity, relatives must face a stark choice of risking their lives and seeking justice or remaining silent. In seeking justice, then they themselves become the target of oppression and vulnerable to threats and violence. Forced disappearances have profound impacts on the emotional life of the victim's family. Relatives are plagued by uncertainty, haunted by hope. I've represented several mothers who 10, 15, 20 years after the disappearance are still making lunch every day for their disappeared child. A forced disappearance atomizes and rearranges family relationships. As parents dedicate themselves to finding the disappeared or fleeing in terror, surviving children must become breadwinners and parents to their siblings and to themselves. The long-term impact on mental and physical health is insidious. There's no refuge to the uncertainty, impotence, and anguish caused by the forced disappearance. The wounds remain open and raw. There's no closure. There's no burial. An estimated 40,000 individuals were disappeared in Guatemala between 1960 and 1996 during the armed conflict. These are images. If you could click on it, it's actually so you can click on it. These are images of a forced disappearance. That are not working. Disappearances often happened on public streets in Guatemala in broad daylight. They often involve armed men dressed as civilians, driving vehicles associated with armed forces, the security forces. The petitioners in the Dasgua dossier case include 127 family members of 28 individuals who were disappeared between 1983 and 1985. Next slide. So let me introduce you to one of those individuals, next slide, whose relatives we represented. This is Amancio Samuel Villatoro. He was a fighter from birth. His father died when he was very young, and his mother depended on the support of family members to survive. He was only able to study until the 3rd grade, although when he moved to Guatemala City, he was able to get his diploma in industrial mechanics. Next slide. He worked at Adams Chicle factory in Guatemala City and eventually became the general secretary of the union. He was very active in unions when it was terribly dangerous to be active in unions in Guatemala. By the end of the war, union membership had decreased by 73% in Guatemala because of forced disappearance, threats, selective killings. Next slide. Villatoro also had a wife and 5 kids. He was the sole provider for the family. On January 4th, 1984, Villatoro left the family home to meet a colleague. He never returned. That night, his house was raided. His wife and children were tied up, threatened at gunpoint. They were told if they ever complained about what happened, they would be killed, and they should leave the country. when they were able to untie themselves, they found Amancio's house key in the door, front door, which is how the armed man had entered the house. Despite the threats, family members submitted a complaint to the police, but no investigation was ever conducted. They visited hospitals, morgues, jails, submitted a writ of habeas corpus. Unions from all over the world sent telegrams to the government calling for justice. More threats came, and the family had to flee to Mexico and eventually to the United States. Next slide. 10 years passed. And in 1984, the government and the guerrilla group signed the peace accords bringing an end to conflict. A truth commission was established. Guatemala government agreed to cooperate with the truth commission by handing over official documents related to the violations. They then claimed that the documents did not exist or had been destroyed. The commission released its report, and 5 days later, this document was smuggled out of Guatemala and given to the woman sitting next to me, Kate Doyle, at the National Security Archive. She analyzed and authenticated the document. Next slide. It's authored by Guatemala Military Intelligence. It includes 183 references to the disappearance and execution of individuals. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. And this entry was also found. This is Amancio Samuel Villatoro. This is the first news his family have had what had happened to him after 15 years. It includes his supposed pseudonym, the fact that he was a salaried member of the CFT. It includes details about his capture, including the date, which is the same date his family home was raided. It includes his original picture from his national ID card, cedula. It also includes a coded reference to his executions in pencil at the end of the entry, March 29, 1984. This means he was in detention for 3 months before he was executed. The Death Squad dossier is the first news the Villatoro family had of Amancio, but it's also the first documentary evidence that Guatemala engaged in systematic and widespread human rights abuses, that there was a state policy to forcibly disappear individuals during the war. So the complaint was submitted in 2005. After this document appeared in 1999 and the criminal complaint was filed, the criminal investigation went nowhere. Next slide. It was submitted before the Inter-American Commission. The Inter-American Human Rights System is composed of 2 bodies, the Commission and the Court. Both have jurisdiction to determine whether a member state has violated treaty obligations under the American Convention. Guatemala ratified the American Convention in 1978 and accepted the jurisdiction from the court in 1987. In order to get to the court, you have to exhaust litigation before the Inter-American System, before the Inter-American Commission. And the court has jurisdiction to issue binding rulings. So family members wanted to take the case to the Inter-American System for a number of reasons. Next slide. Essential for the family members was the possibility of obtaining a binding decision from the Inter-American Court, but also being on equal footing with the state and the opportunity to provide their evidence of what happened before an impartial and independent tribunal. There are 2 things that never happened in the forced disappearance case, and both happened in this case. The first is that you seldom have evidence of the disappearance, and we had copious amounts of documentary evidence. 80 million pages of official documents were discovered and accidentally in a police basement. Thousands of these documents are related to the disappearance of my client's loved ones. The second thing that never happens in a case, or rarely in a forced disappearance case, is that you find the remains. The remains. Next slide. Next slide. So these 5 entries have one thing in common. They all have the same date of execution, March 29, 1984. And in 2011, an NGO, an anthropology group in Guatemala, announced the discovery of remains of 3 of these individuals, including Samuel Yagoro Amancio. Next slide. His body was found on a military base 60 miles from Guatemala City, along with another of the relatives of clients we represent. His widow said, next slide, that the ground had had his bones for too long, and so now his remains are displayed in the museum. His remains were found along with the remains of 265 other individuals, and there was torture pen left. There is imprint on many of these bones. So in last April of 2012, we had a hearing before the Inter-American Court. Experts testified, and we also testified. She's going to speak in a little bit about her experience. And on December 21st, 2012, we received a ruling from the Inter-American Court. The court held that upper echelons of the Guatemalan military had conspired with police and politicians to target and eliminate the disappeared due to their perceived political and social views. The court found that Guatemala not only had detained, tortured, and secretly executed the victims, but had violated the rights of their families by subjecting their relatives to ongoing threats and intimidation, failing to investigate, and withholding information about the disappearances. As reparations, the court ordered Guatemala to investigate, prosecute, and punish those responsible, to recover the victims' remains, to construct a national park dedicated to the memory of the victims, to produce a documentary about the crimes, and to pay more than $8 million in economic compensation to the victims' families. During the 7 years of litigation, before the Inter-American system, Guatemala was represented by COPERE, which is a government agency, part of the executive. After initially questioning the authenticity of the death squad dossier, state representatives used a somewhat predictable defense strategy. They accepted state responsibility for the indefensible and litigated less central issues in an attempt to limit state liability. And in accordance with this strategy, state authorities accepted responsibility for disappearances, failure to investigate. They reaffirmed the authenticity of the death squad dossier. They complied with the Commission's orders to hand over state documents, and they supported the petition that the case be referred to the Inter-American Court. Once the case was submitted to the court, the state continued in a similar line of defense until January of 2012, which is when Otto Pérez Molina's administration assumed power in Guatemala. At the April hearing, we saw the government radically change its position. Now represented by the new Secretary of Peace and head of COPERE, Antonio Arenales Forno, the government refuted responsibility for failing to investigate and prosecute those responsible. The Secretary argued that the 1996 peace accords reached by the military and guerrilla granted an amnesty for crimes committed during the conflict, including those crimes like forced disappearance, torture, and genocide, explicitly exempted from the amnesty. He went further in press interviews to say that prosecutors or judges involved in investigation or prosecution of the crimes committed during the conflict were acting illegally and unethically. After the court issued its ruling in 2012, the government moved to block the ruling's legal impact in Guatemala by issuing an executive decree. Next slide. Establishing the court had no jurisdiction over human rights abuses committed prior to 1987. This is the decree, the year in which Guatemala recognized the court's jurisdiction. The legislation was an attempt to bar many victims of Guatemala's internal conflict from seeking remedies through the court, continuing violations such as forced disappearance or ongoing denial of justice. The decree drew widespread criticism and was withdrawn, but in practice, the decree continues to be implemented. In the recent briefs submitted, and I'm finalizing here, so I know I'm totally out of time, I apologize. The administration has stated that it will not comply with the ruling, arguing that the Inter-American Court lacks jurisdiction to decide the case, that Guatemala cannot be held responsible for violations for domestic crimes, and only Guatemala can decide the scope of the court's jurisdiction and what reparations are owed to victims. These positions not only impact compliance in the death squad dossier case, but inter-American rulings dating back to 2012. The court has found Guatemala consistently responsible for ongoing violations in the Bamaka Velasquez case, the Fernandez Sanchez massacre case, and the Molina Tessin disappearance case, in the Los Eres massacre case, in the Chifeine case, in the Rio Negro massacre case, and the Fernando Garcia disappearance. And the state is now thumbing its nose at this consistent jurisprudence. The effectiveness, the very effectiveness of the Inter-American system is in jeopardy given this state's position. And I'm going to end there. I apologize. Hold on to you.